Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome to the latest Duke Media Briefing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on society. I'm Allison Jones with Duke Communications. We're learning more about the origins of the coronavirus, that causes COVID-19, and what we're learning suggests that we should be paying a lot more attention to the intersection of the human and animal worlds. We have three Duke scholars with us today to discuss how understanding the ways that viruses transfer from animals to humans is key to preventing future pandemics. With us today is Lin-Fo Wang. He's a professor in the Emerging Infectious Diseases program at Duke-NUS Medical School in Singapore, and he's a faculty member with the Duke Global Health Institute. He studies the transmission of viruses from bats to humans and has researched the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. Also joining us is Gregory Gray. He's a professor of medicine, global health, and environmental health at Duke, and he also holds appointments at Duke-NUS Medical School in Singapore and Kunshan University in China. He's studied infectious diseases for 25 years across 5 continents. And we have Stuart Pimm. He's a professor of conservation ecology at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. He's on a team that found that reducing deforestation and the wildlife trade could help prevent future pandemics. Thank you all for joining us. Professor Wang, I'd like to start with you. What have researchers been able to learn thus far about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic? Can you summarize where we are in that search?
Thank you, Alison, and thank you for having me. So maybe I start to define, the viruses we're dealing with, right? So we have this virus called SARS-CoV-2, and it's responsible for COVID-19. So I call this is the outbreak virus. And we believe that this virus is evolved from a very close virus we call the progenitor virus. And then the progenitor virus evolved from their great-grandfather we call the ancestral virus. And so what we can say for certain right now scientifically is the ancestral virus of SARS-CoV-2 come from bats. But in terms of the progenitor virus, whether it's a bat-borne virus, and how that get into Wuhan, I think this is really a hot topic for research, and there's scientifically no conclusive data yet.
Terrific. That's really interesting, and we'll have more questions about that. In the meantime, thank you. In the meantime, Dr. Gray, I'd like to turn to you. The virus that causes COVID-19 is the latest in a string of new viral threats. How would you characterize our current approach to new viral threats?
Well, Allison, thanks for the question, and it's a great one. We've attempted to predict, if you will, these viral threats, but we've missed the specific viruses in both 2009 and 2019. So we haven't done so well. We've done much better at responding, but that's not the greatest strategy to wait till something is a problem and we suffer all this morbidity and mortality and economic loss. So we have sort of what I consider to be a whack-a-mole policy right now. We wait until a pathogen causes a lot of morbidity and then we respond. And we've got to figure out a better way to predict these and mitigate them before they cause a lot of harm.
That's an excellent point, and I'd love to hear more about that later. Next, we're going to turn to Professor Pimm. Professor Pimm, zoonotic diseases or diseases that spread between animals and humans are on the rise, with the COVID-19 pandemic being the most recent example. Does our management of the natural environment play a role in this increase? And if so, how?
I think it plays a dominant role. It's important not to think of this as being some exceptional event that's happened just once and it won't happen again for 100 years. But 2 or 3 major viruses spill into the human population each year. There have been other viruses like this. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there was HIV, which killed at least 10 million people around the world. In all cases, it's a consequence of our human actions imposing upon the natural world. In the case of HIV, it was cutting down forests in West Africa and people, getting blooded from butchering chimpanzees. In this case, it's by contact with bats or some other related species. And it's clear there's a lot of very cost-effective things we can do to prevent that kind of abuse of the world's natural ecosystems, limiting wildlife trade, limiting the number of species we use for bushmeat.
Interesting. Thank you very much for those opening comments. So now we're going to take some questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. A reminder that you can also pose questions via the Q&A window at any time. So if you'd like to ask your question in person, raise your hand in Zoom and we'll unmute you when your turn comes around. If you're calling in by phone, you could raise your hand by pressing *9. And thanks also to everyone who's watching on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. So please do send along your questions or raise your hand. In the meantime, I'll turn to some questions that have already been submitted. Professor Wang, how long will it take us to find a conclusive answer to these questions about the origins of the coronavirus that caused the COVID-19 pandemic? And where should we be looking for answers?
That's a good question because I can give you a range, right? So I personally have been involved in 6 major emerging zoonotic viruses and started my career in Australia, and we discovered the hendra virus. So, it's a small outbreak with a case fatality 50% in human and 75% in horses. It's highly lethal. It took us around 2 years to eventually find that it's a bat virus and transmit to horses and to human. For SARS, I was involved as well. And again, it took 2 years to find a related virus and took another 8 years to find an even closer related virus. And then for Ebola, we knew that, from the 70s that it kills and affects human, and it's an animal to human jump. And depends on which theory you take, we still have not figured out exactly where the virus is. So that's 50 years, and we're still searching. So this is a good question, but I cannot give you a conclusive answer in terms of when we will find the real origin. So, but in terms of how we should approach it, then I think that, go with my first opening, comment is that we know, that scientists agree on that one, the ancestral virus is coming from bats. And also we know that there are a specific genus of bats called the rhinoceros bats or horseshoe bats are the reservoir of both SARS-1 and SARS-2 ancestral virus. So that if you look at the distribution of these bats, it goes from Australia to Asia to Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Europe. So I always say, most likely the hotspot is Southern China and the Southeast Asia, but we have to be open-minded. In terms of scientific approach, I'm a strong believer of going for the antibodies, because these are the immune responses, whether you're human or bats, when you have a viral exposure, you have this immune response, and one of them is antibody. And the antibody will stay in the body much longer than the virus. The virus infection will get clear. In bats, virus always at a very low viral load. So to me is that, that's my own research. I'm using serology to lead the way, and we succeeded for hendra, Nipah, SARS, and now I'm working on SARS-CoV-2 using the same approach. Once the serology point to a hot zone and a hot species, and then we go longitudinal study and try to find the whole genetic sequence.
Terrific. Dr. Gray, I wanted to ask you, I know that you are an advocate for doing more surveillance. You mentioned our whack-a-mole approach to surveillance in your opening comments. Where and how should we be doing more surveillance?
Well, I think we've done quite a bit of surveillance in the past. We have groups that have focused almost entirely on detecting pathogens that reside in wildlife, and often these have been sponsored by USAID. Some of those programs, Predict 1, Predict 2, Stop Spillover, and there's a new one coming on, Deep VZN. They've discovered a lot of viruses, but those viruses have not always, and frankly, in fact, infrequently been associated with illness in man. And they're continuing to move down that road. There's another philosophy It focuses on known human pathogens, and this has been embraced by US NIH, NIAID, US CDC, where we study pathogens that have already crossed over to man, and we attempt to mitigate those by developing diagnostics and vaccines. And so these responses have been useful in helping us to respond to pandemics. But while we are responding, many people are being sick. And in this case of this pandemic, many people have died. So I'm advocating for something in between these two polar positions. The thing that we call basically is a One Health virus discovery focus, where we would study in areas that are known to be hotspots for emerging infectious diseases, humans that work with animals and their animals, and we would see what pathogens are already beginning to take hold in the humans. The idea is evolutionary medicine would suggest that it takes many years for viruses to adapt, as Linfo would say, from a bat to becoming cause an infection to man, and then cause limited chains of human-to-human infection, and finally be very efficient in causing human-human infections. So we have time if we look for the novel viruses at the human-animal interface instead of at these other polar positions. We have time to detect new viruses. We have time to develop mitigation strategies, and that's sort of what we're advocating: networks of surveillance at the human-animal interface. And when we can't do that due to various obstacles, we would then look at for respiratory pathogens, people that develop pneumonia in those geographical hotspots.
If I might add to that, Alison, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I think there are some other low-hanging fruit too. I mean, why bats? Well, bats are often colonial breeders. They often in very, very high densities in caves. That's exactly the kind of environment where you'd expect diseases to spread. Rodents, much as we might turn our nose up at rodents, a lot of people around the world eat rodents, and monkeys, primates. So I think there are clusters of species, primates, bats, rodents, which are obvious targets, and they have their greatest diversity in the world's tropical moist forests, which we are cutting down at a very, very heavy rate. And then the other side of this is that we are amazingly careless in moving species around the world. We have almost no screening when people transport species, across national boundaries. That's something also that would be a very prudent investment of our research effort and of our energy to try and slow these things down.
Great point. We have a question in the Q&A, and I think this one probably is for you, Professor Wang. It's which animals are at the top of the list as the likely carriers of the progenitor virus?
Yeah, so this is, again, very good question. And that's actually my kind of research focus. And I approach this in three different ways, right? The first is that could learn from SARS and learn from the SARS-CoV-2, so there are animals that already known can be infected either in the lab or in nature. So for example, pangolins, civets, raccoon dogs, and other wildlife. And secondly is that now we have a scientific approach because we know the receptor for this virus is the ACE2. So there are lots of paper published, and I just co-authored a paper published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, is that we examined over 50 species and look at this ACE2, and then of course in a artificial environment, express them in a cell line and looking for susceptibility. So if the animal has a ACE2 really have high affinity to the SARS-CoV-2, then you have a high chance of being infected. The third one is the most kind of sensitive and difficult. I have a theory, that there is just like what Professor Pimm just says, there's a massive animal sort of movements and not enough screening is done. The legal part is already difficult to really monitor. the illegal part is even more difficult. So if you think of that, the pandemic or the emerging of zoonotic viruses, it happens like every 7 to now 10 years. And so it's not a really frequent event. So if you go with the legal trading of the animals, if they carry the virus into China, into Wuhan, I think it will happen more frequently. So this is where the difficult part is that if you give me the chance to screen both the illegally transferred and the legally transferred, I will focus on the illegally transferred because that one is much less frequent and usually is much more high value and very hard to get. So these are the animals I think, I will, if I have the access to them. And, now sort of inside China and in Southeast Asia, you have these confiscated animals. What that means is that illegal trading that stopped at certain stations along the trading line. And so we just have a paper in Nature Communication with our collaborators in Thailand. From a confiscated, a center, only 10 pangolins in that facility, and one of them already have neutralizing antibody to SARS-CoV-2. So these are the 3 ways, 3 approaches we're using, and I think that will narrow down the targets.
Thank you so much. And we have some more questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those. Please keep sending those. But in the meantime, a sort of big picture question. And this could be for any of the panelists, I think. But Dr. Gray, I'd like to start with you. Why are we seeing more viral outbreaks in the big picture? What has changed? Human beings have been hunting and farming and interacting with the natural world for centuries. What has changed?
Well, I think you're right with that last comment. Hominids have been harvesting wildlife for food for an estimated 200 million years. And so it's not simply our contact with wildlife, although periodic as it is today. I think there have been a number of other things that have happened. One is the very large, dense populations of people in megacities that are in close proximity to large animal populations that can serve as an intermediate reservoir for amplifying novel viruses, for instance, from wildlife. That has really changed in the last 50 years. We have gone to industrialized farming throughout the world. And it's good that we do, because we need industrialized farming to produce enough protein to feed the growing human population. But that industrialized farming comes with its costs. And one of the costs is a virus that doesn't kill those animals can get into those large, dense populations and churn, make many copies of itself, and periodically mutate. And sometimes those viruses are successful in crossing over to the animal workers. And so that's why we need to do surveillance at the human-animal nexus, particularly, I think, in the domestic animal farms. Another reason, I think Stuart alluded to it, is that we're seeing the movement of people, the movement of animals, and the movement of animal products, food, at a rate we've never seen before. We've moved in quantities and in speeds. And so if a person or an animal or a food product harbors a novel virus, that can be moved rather quickly halfway around the world and cause a threat to a different population. And we also, a third element I think is key here, is we have better diagnostic systems today. 50 years ago, we didn't really know what would cause this epidemic. But today, we have some of the tools to detect these and better explain them.
Excellent points. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
No, I think that nails it. I mean, there are more of us. We are more concentrated in where we live. I mean, the growth of megacities in China has been explosive. And there's also a sense amongst some people that exotic animals as food is somehow a measure of their of their social success. There are many of these species that you can see ready to be butchered in restaurants in China whenever you walk into them. I think there are things like that where there is a hope that we can change public attitudes towards, eating exotic food, which, in this particular case may have turned around and killed us.
Yeah, so maybe I can jump in here. I think, Professor Pimm, is that it's a cultural and a social status, So 17 years ago, we knew that SARS was transmitted to human through the intermediate animal called a civet. So I grew up in Shanghai, I left for USA 82, and I have never heard of civets until SARS outbreak. But in southern China near Guangdong province, civet was not popular until the economic boom. So people are rich enough, they want exotic, food, and the civets was considered to be very expensive, especially during winter time. And then during the SARS outbreak, at the peak of the SARS outbreak, a group identified civets as the intermediate host. And in China, usually you don't have this, opinion poll, but credit to the Guangdong government, they try to mobilize the citizen to say this is really, it's a tradition in our province, but the risk is that, you have virus coming in with the animal and it can kill you. So at the peak of the SARS outbreak in 2003, they did a public opinion sort of a poll. And you know what? The question is to say, number one, do you want to keep the tradition and run into the risk of another pandemic? Number two is let's change the tradition and close down this live animal market. And you know the answer? During the peak of SARS, 79% people went for one, keep the tradition and we take the risk.
Wow, that's pretty interesting statistic. So Dr. Wang, Professor Wang, since we're with you, we have a question for you in the Q&A, which is that could cold chain transmission have touched off the Wuhan outbreak?
Yeah, so that's a very hot question, and there's a lot of debate about that. My scientific take, actually, we have data. We actually did that experiment. If you spread the virus on surface of meat, we tried, both fish and pork and beef. So if you freeze these and then for weeks, and then if you sort of thaw the meat and the virus is still alive, but we put a lot of virus onto that. So personally, I think there's three ways you can bring that progenitor virus to Wuhan and cause the outbreak. So frozen food is a possibility, but I rank them as number three. And the top two are animals, right? Or the top two, one is animal, but now I think that more and more people are thinking there is a possibility a human carries a progenitor virus. That's why at that time it's not very transmissible and it does not cause severe disease. So even if you have a small cluster, transmission, let's say from September to November, nobody will know until that virus either jump to a human, get an adaptive mutation, become the outbreak virus, or it can be human to animal transmission in that Huanan seafood market, because there was a massive transmission going on that market for sure, with two reasons, or two really clues. One is that the first cluster, around 40 to 50 patients went to the hospital, has severe pneumonia. 80% has an epidemiology link to that market. Secondly, is that market has a seafood section and has a live animal section. And in the live animal section, they have heavy environmental contamination. So the China CDC team went in on December 31st, and they take swabs of the environmental cage, the stools and things like that. And they got lots of positive samples. They even have 2 samples. They were able to isolate live virus. So 3 possibilities: the virus brought to Wuhan by a human, by animal, or by frozen food. And I would rank the frozen food as number 3. Not impossible, but low probability.
Thanks so much. So a question, this is probably for everyone, but I'll start with Dr. Gray. Could finding the origins of SARS-CoV-2 help us understand how the virus is evolving, and could it help guide treatments and vaccines? And related, how might understanding the origins help us prepare for future pandemics? So two different questions there.
Well, certainly, I think it will help us put together this puzzle for this pandemic. But you know, there are an estimated 1,200 different coronaviruses out there. Any which of any one of these could potentially cause a new problem. And on top of that, there are many other respiratory viruses that move in a similar way. And so we can't just focus on, you know, the heritage of this pandemic virus. We need to think about a bunch of other viruses. We need to think about all the influenza viruses. We need to think about the enteroviruses. We need to think about some of the paramyxal viruses and some of the adenoviruses. They too have caused epidemics. And a number of those are RNA viruses and very unstable, and they reside in animals. And so again, I think what we have to do is have a better pulse regarding what viral threats are out there, which may be crossing over and being amplified in domestic animals. And where we can't do that surveillance, like in the United States, it's really hard to do surveillance in our large animal populations because the meat processing industries don't want public health in there. And so we have to think of an alternative approach. Another approach is to look at people who have severe illness and to examine their clinical specimens with discovery diagnostics. So we've actually at our group, and we've published this paper just recently in Open Forum Infectious Diseases, we focused on 5 viral families, and we have diagnostic pan-species detection tools to look at people with pneumonia or people that work in the animal industry. And recently we discovered, we got a signal basically in equatorial Sarawak, which is eastern Malaysia, of 8 patients with a never seen before canine coronavirus. And through a process of a lot of viral sleuthing, our partners, our collaborators at Ohio State University, particularly Dr. Vlasova, was able to not only culture this virus, but to sequence its whole genome. And it's a hybrid virus, a recombinant virus between dog and cat coronaviruses that seems to have crossed over. So now we're investigating the epidemiological nature of that virus in Sarawak. And it's a good example of how we need to do surveillance that's much broader than going retrospectively and looking at this one virus.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question? If not, I have a question for you, Professor Pimm. You've described tropical forest edges as major launch pads for new human viruses. Can you say a bit more about why that is?
It's really just a matter of the proximity in most cases. Sometimes the edges themselves are where particular kinds of mosquitoes hang out. But it's that juxtaposition of people and rainforests and their edges. I mean, the most obvious example of that is HIV. Almost certainly that came into our species because people went into the West African forests and started butchering chimpanzees for meat. And you know, the chimpanzees were presumably fine with the immunodeficient virus that they had, but it's when it came into us and began to mutate, as we've heard from my colleagues, that we begin to have a problem. So it's this notion of our moving into places where we really don't need to be. We really don't need to be eating bats. We really don't need to be having a close proximity to monkeys and pangolins and many of these other species that are involved, civets. So part of this is that we're just going into places where in a way we are not adapted to live, and we are paying a very heavy price for what is really a fringe activity. I mean, by and large, we're not getting these viruses from our crop fields. We're getting some of them from domestic animals when we keep them in very high concentrations. But a lot of these are spilling over from places where we have not traditionally lived, and where they are clearly a lot of other things there that can harm us.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gray, we have a question in the Q&A. I wonder if you might address this. This reporter is asking, if we know that PPE helps reduce the spread of viral infections among humans, should PPE also be used when humans interact with animals so that novel viruses don't have a place to replicate?
Well, that's been an amazing revelation, has it not? That the PPE that we've worn both in the science laboratory and in the community has greatly reduced not only the spread of this coronavirus, but also the seasonal spread of influenza A viruses. You know, and I think the social distancing measures have also played a role. How much, I don't know, but you know, certainly the mask wearing, the social distancing seems to have been an important component. We already wear personal protective gear when we handle wildlife. That's often required by the ethical reviews of when we want to engage in wildlife. So that's being done to some extent. What is not being done is, you know, people that harvest or that grow wildlife on farms, you know, people that are reptile fanciers, people that are mammal fanciers, people that grow bats for whatever reason in large colonies. You know, they don't often wear masks, and so we may see more of that in the future as we begin to see if we note the value of it.
Thank you so much. So we have a question about Hunan. This reporter is asking, in the virus samples that were acquired from the Hunan seafood market, can you say which animals were nearby or on the contaminated surface? I think that's a question for Professor Wang.
That's right, I guess, yeah. So I think the WHO report, we hope will come out very soon. And there are no scientific paper, but there are media, you know, reports there. And I have seen a menu before the closure of that particular market. Unfortunately, it's in Chinese, you know, so it goes from, you know, civets to snakes to rats to everything. The difficult part is that when CDC went in, they not only sampled the environmental sort of parts, but they also sampled the animal, you know, whether it's meat or live animal. And unfortunately, you know, according to the report, is that only the environmental samples are positive. All the animal samplings were negative. So two possibilities, you know, the animal was doing lots of replication, has been sold out, or the animal that traded should not be there. Of course, when you have a government team comes in and the animal was removed before the team arrived. Okay, so from that particular study, you know, we cannot tell which animal is most likely share the virus in the market.
Thank you so much. So a question for Professor Pimm. Professor Pimm, you're an expert on wild animals and their environments. What steps should we be taking to decrease disease spread between wild animals and humans?
I think the first thing we can do, and certainly the cheapest thing we can do, is that we can ramp up several of the initiatives that were in place, you know, in administrations before the previous one, where we use our international aid to encourage countries, you know, not to chop their forests down. Chopping down the Amazon, for example, has almost no economic benefit. It doesn't produce a lot of cattle once you've chopped it down. For a very few $billion, we can stop Amazon deforestation and similar sorts of issues around the world. We can do that, it's cheap, it's straightforward. We spend almost no money on looking at the international trade in wildlife. There is an organization called CITES, which is supposed to monitor the trade in endangered species. It is woefully underfunded. I think we could be a lot smarter in terms of moving, species around the world. And I'm a lot more optimistic than Professor Wang about, for example, what the Chinese can do. When I visit China, which is often I have close association with Duke Kunshan, I'm now impressed by all the signs up in the airports telling people how they will go to jail if they start trading in ivory. I think there are ways in which nations can begin to persuade their citizens that eating civets and other exotic wildlife is a bad idea. So in the paper that my colleagues and I published in Science last year, we lay out a few of these things, all of which are prudent, simple, economically really good value. And without wanting in any way to diminish what my colleagues have said about the viral testing, which was really important. I think there are just a lot of sensible measures we can take as a nation and encouraging other nations, other governments around the world to minimize our conflict with wildlife and the ecosystems where they live.
Terrific. We have a question in the Q&A. In the past year, what have scientists learned about the bat version of SARS-CoV-2? I think this is a question for you, Professor Wang. Professor Wang, have they narrowed down at all the geological location for this virus? Must mean geographical.
Yeah. So in the less than a year now, actually, so the first paper really, the Nature paper came from Wuhan Institute of Virology, did the genome sequencing and say, they found a bat virus which is 96% identical and was sampled in 2013 in Yunnan province, very, very close to the border to Myanmar. And so this is the first paper point to say that it's a bat virus. As I said, the ancestral virus come from bats. And then since then, so the most papers go back to their samples in the freezer and then just do whole genome sequencing. And then another group in China discovered there are two other viruses in Zhejiang province from their archive samples, which have like 90% genome identity. And a Japanese group found that in Japan, the bats in Japan have another virus, which is also around the 91% identical. And we collaborate with the group in Thailand. And last month, we published a paper to say that in Thailand, from bats to pangolins, they have this virus circulating. And then there are two papers now in the preprints, that one from Cambodia and one from China. So in a very short period of around 10 months, and mostly use archive samples, you just go back to your bat specimens and you resequence them, and you already found at least 7, 8 different what we call SARS-CoV-2 related virus. So the bad news is that that actually expand the geographic location, go all the way from Japan to southern Thailand and Cambodia. And I calculated the direct distance is 5,000 kilometers. So I think, this is why I always say to pinpoint down the origin of a virus like SARS-CoV-2, it's not going to be an easy task.
And I want to return to this question of the origin of SARS-CoV-2. And this is a question for anyone, really. Why is that so important to pinpoint? What's at stake in learning the origin?
Oh, I have a go first. I think,
sure.
Yeah, I think, there's two major, reasons. One is scientific, one is public health, right? scientific is that if you know the origin and the geographic location, and then you will understand that what triggered the spillover, right? If it's a bat virus, then how bat can transmit to human in Wuhan. If the bat is not in Wuhan, and most likely I think it's not a bat in Wuhan, it's somewhere in southern China and Southeast Asia. So by pinpoint down where is the origin of the virus, which animal, and then you can work out the potential, route of transmission. So that comes to the second reason for public health is that only after you know this, then you can prevent the next, outbreak. So I'll give you again, my own experience. We helped the Malaysian scientists to pinpoint down the origin of the Nipah virus outbreak, and not only that, in which village the Nipah virus, in which bat, and in which farm, and they turn out to be that a flying fox in a colony, and then in those days, Malaysian government allowed the pig farms to do fruit tree farm. So you have the fruit tree basically over the pig pen to provide a shelter for the pig down the tree, underneath the tree, and at the same time you do fruit farming. Sounds like a very, very creative and productive idea, but through the investigation into origin early transmission event, you identify a huge risk factor. You have bats hanging over pig pen, and the half-eaten, fruits were dropped to the pig pen, and that's caused the transmission of the virus. And that's the basis of this movie Contagion. For those of you who have not watched, you should watch that, because that's the whole. Even the Hollywood movie, would not be possible if we did not do the origin investigation. So that's the third reason to make a Hollywood movie.
I think that's a great story, and it makes all sorts of interesting points.
Yeah.
But I also think, the specific point is unassailable. But I also think it's important in the sense that it illustrates, it's not a good idea for us to be too close to nature.
Yeah.
We really don't need to get, into bed, as it were, with fruit bats, flying foxes. So I think there are some general, general ideas that come out of that are well worth learning from too.
So a question for anyone who cares to weigh in on this. One thing you all have touched on, several of you have touched on, is that consuming exotic animals may be part of the problem we're seeing. But there are many parts of the world where people are hungry, and there are also many parts of the world where there's a strong cultural tradition that supports this kind of consumption. So what do you say to those who would say people have to feed their families? What's your response? How can you convince those folks, or what would you say to them about the importance of conservation versus the pressing need to feed their families?
So go ahead.
I just wanted to echo somewhat Allison's comment. There's been a series of comments on the internet saying that we in the developed world are castigating the values of the developing world and suggesting that they change their culture and their way of life in ways that are not necessarily proven with data. And so it's this debate, if you will, about our social systems, our ethnic values, and our tramping on the values of people in the developing world. I think we have supportive data that the contact with wildlife and for many different pathogens, pathogens are moving both ways, not only from animals to humans, but from humans to animals, in some ways causing a lot of decimation, for instance, of some of the non-human primates. But, is it really solid evidence that that is the cause, for instance, of the 2009 H1N1 pandemic? And I would say no. It's our contact with large domestic farms in Mexico that's been implicated. And again, I think, we've been eating bush meat for 200,000 years, our ancestors and all. What has changed? You know, I think it's the large populations of people mixed with large populations of animals and domestic farming that we need to focus on, and maybe not beat up so many people with respect to them occasionally harvesting a rodent because they're starving.
This is a very complicated issue, and we talk about it at length in our paper. There are clearly aspects of bushmeat that involve people, people trying to feed themselves, and we understand that that's something that we cannot we cannot ignore. That it's there, it's important. There are some cultures that depend entirely on that for their survival. On the other hand, there's a lot of this that really isn't driven by hunger. You do not need to butcher chimpanzees to be able to feed your family. They're too rare. There's not a lot of them around. There are aspects of bushmeat, as we heard about from Professor Wang about the civets. There are aspects of this that make it a high status item that people consume. I think it's those things we have to target. And we're not saying you should stop all bushmeat hunting when that's not going to be possible. But there are clearly some, as it were, low-hanging fruit. There are clearly some consumptions of wild species that we could and should stop. And that will, everything we can do along those lines would help.
Excellent points all around. So we have a question in the Q&A. Is the reason that we don't know the exact source of the virus because it's been difficult to pinpoint in general, or has it been difficult to investigate in China because of access or political reasons?
I think I can take that one. I think, I was on the mission to China to investigate the origin of the SARS-CoV-1, so 17 years ago. So that I think a short answer to this question is both. I will put 80% is scientifically difficult and 20% is the current political environment is not the most conducive to do this kind of research. And also the current pandemic, I mean, let's face it, right? The pandemic is still ongoing. So that's why the WHO mission to China last month spent 2 weeks zooming from a hotel in Wuhan. And I feel like what a waste of time. You can zoom in from New York and London, right? So I think both the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, and the political sort of environment is not conducive to this kind of research. But that's only a minor part. The major part, as I said, is it's difficult. So 17 years ago, the same mission went to China. I was one of the 8 international panel members, and we arrived in Beijing, and we went to 3 institutes in Beijing, including a military medical institute. So we have free access. We went to Guangzhou, again, 2 institutes. We went to Shenzhen, 3 institutes. So, and we even went to farm, the market, the live animal market, everything. And what we got 2 weeks after that field trip is a report, exactly the same as the report we're going to see in 2 weeks' time. So I feel like, the public and to a certain degree, the media, I think may have this perception that the mission to China to investigate the origin of SARS-CoV-2 is for scientists to go there to sample, and suddenly you get a new sample and new discovery, you find the origin. I think that's the wrong way of thinking of a mission. The mission is really to do brainstorming, to do relation building, networking, and that's what I did during that mission. I, met a lot of scientists, and I came back with the hypothesis that bats could be the reservoir. And at that time, nobody believed it, but eventually I found the collaborators, and we had a consortium, 5 labs from 3 nations, Australia, China, USA. Eventually, we found the origin. So again, to summarize, the short answer to your question is 80%, I think, is just too difficult, and 20% is the current environment is not conducive.
Thank you so much. So I'll put this out to whoever would like to tackle it. So new coronavirus variants continue to be discovered. How does that affect your expectations for the pandemic for the coming year?
Well, let me try to field that. Maybe I'm the physician here. I think we have been, because of a lot of the previous work, for instance, from the NIAID in developing vaccine constructs and diagnostics, we've been able to respond to this pandemic with speed we've never seen before. And with magnitude of vaccines, the number of vaccines and the quantity of those vaccines that we've never seen before. So I'm not too worried that we're going to see a novel virus emerge from this virus that's somehow going to circumvent our present diagnostic systems or interventions. I'm just not too worried about that at all, because I think we can adjust if there are antigen changes in the circulating viruses. We can adjust those same vaccines that are working against the viruses that we face today. What I'm worried about are the next very different viruses that are going to impact us. And we're still not very effective at predicting those. We're not effective at detecting them before they become highly transmitted. We, in fact, just kind of wait for that case series to occur in our emergency rooms. You know, it occurred in Wuhan this time. Where is it going to occur next? And how long is it going to take us to respond to that new virus, whether it's a coronavirus or another type of virus? You know, those are the questions. And it's really unfortunate that we're not more aggressive at attempting to detect these as they're just taking hold of the immune system. It probably takes many years for a virus to move from a bat to being efficient and causing disease and human-human transmission in man.
Thank you so much for that. Building on that, Dr. Gray, how likely do you think it is that we will see another pandemic-capable virus emerge? And how likely do you think we'll see that again?
Well, I think many people would agree that 100% likely. You know, what's the time frame? You know, so we had one pandemic in 2009. Now we got another in 2019. Every 10 years, I don't know. You know what the distance between pandemics is going to be, but in between those time periods, we've had a number of epidemics of other respiratory viruses. Fortunately, they didn't cause big pandemics. So you think of the hundreds of thousands of people that were infected with an enterovirus 71 in Asia, the hand, foot, and mouth disease enteroviruses. We've had similar enteroviruses in the US, 𝐓𝐡𝐞, and it's caused some weird manifestations, a polio-like illness. We've had something called the killer cold virus. It's an adenovirus 14 that was a rare virus, suddenly came up in the United States and now has been found in multiple countries that has caused a lot of morbidity and some deaths, particularly in dense populated areas, even among healthy people. And of course, all the influenza viruses, many of those, particularly our eyes are on avian flus and swine influenzas as potentially causing pandemics. So there's a lot of things to be concerned about besides this one coronavirus.
Thank you so much for that. So we're starting to run out of time here. So I'd like to pose one final question and hear from each of you on this. And that the question is, what's one key thing that we should do now to prevent the next pandemic? Dr. Gray, if you want to kick things off since we're with you.
Well, I'm going to sing the same song. We need to find ways to do One Health research, surveillance at the human-animal nexus in partnership with big agriculture. We've got to find ways to protect their business interests and yet anticipate new viruses that are going to emerge and cause morbidity in both their animals and potentially in humans. And there are a bunch of new tools to do that. We have aerosol samplers, we have water samplers. Those of us in the human health field have much more tools, many more tools and many more resources to help them. But there's a big pushback from industry. They're really concerned that we might harm their businesses.
Professor Wang, what would you say to that question? What's one key thing we should do now to prevent the next pandemic?
Actually, I'm going to jump on the last point that Greg just made. So he talked about industry, right? So industry is reluctant if we just drive science and prevent the next, epidemic or pandemic. So that's one. But I go to the next level is at the country level. I have, worked in China, USA, Australia, now in Singapore. I think not a single nation wants you to discover virus in their country. So if we don't change that, I think we have little hope of have a very transparent and also I think a legally binding infrastructure to report and early mitigation of an infection, whether it's a virus or anything else. So I think that we have to treat virus like a common enemy, politics aside, and like fighting terrorists or fighting crimes. So I was thinking that the Interpol, for example, is an international organization to fight crime. So can we have something like that to find future viruses? Because that these are our common enemies. So as a basic research scientist, I'm thinking that what I can do to improve is actually limited. I think the infrastructure, the international agreement, the legal framework, and also the industry versus public health interface, all these need to really rethink, and we need to have a new model if we want to prevent that. Every 10 years we have a major outbreak.
An Interpol for fighting viruses. That's a great concept. Professor Pimm, what would you say to that? What's one key thing we should do now?
I think one thing that comes out of everything that you've just heard is that from three very different backgrounds, we all are telling you that this is not a unique event. We've had previous outbreaks. Some of them, like HIV, killed far more people than COVID-19 has. But this emergence of diseases is routine. Some of them are small, some of them are catastrophic. We have to start doing things that will change that dynamic. This is not the last one. That's an awful, terrible, depressing thing to say, but there's more where this came from. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to do everything in our power to reduce the likelihood of the next event.
Terrific. That's great. And we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to our great panelists, Lin-Fe Wang, Greg Gray, and Stuart Pimm for sharing your perspectives. Next week, Mark McClellan will join us to discuss COVID-19 variants. If you'd like to attend that briefing, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, please stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.